A luxury cruise ship is being held at bay just outside New Zealand waters because most of the crew on board have been denied visas. The boat, Laperouse, was granted an economic exemption to come here for cruise season, but any workers on board needed to get special visas to cross our closed borders. The ship set sail from Jakarta just 2 days after filing visa applications for 90 foreign crew. Immigration New Zealand says while the ship was en route, it was told not once but 2 times that 61 of the crew had been denied entry visas because they're not critical workers. But Laperouse kept on coming, only to be denied entry on arrival. Well, joining me now is the Immigration Minister, Kris Faafoi. Minister, how long can that ship sit out there bobbing around at sea before a solution is found?
Well, hopefully not too long. I'm sure that the people who contracted the ship don't want to have it floating around for too much longer. But as I said this afternoon when we raised this issue, our preference is that they stop hovering around our economic exclusion zone border and go somewhere else to make sure that they can refuel and restock if they need to.
What other options are there?
If they were needing to come to dock in New Zealand, there are a couple of options. They can come here and dock, and the ship has actually been approved for some maintenance and delivery here in New Zealand. The 29 staff or crew of that ship who have been approved visas could stay, but the 61 who aren't crucial for that would have to leave immediately. The other option is, if it were to come in port here in New Zealand, is that the ship could refuel, restock, and all 90 crew on board would have to leave as soon as possible.
So if they were to come ashore and the crew have to leave New Zealand, who picks up the tab for that?
It's my clear intention that they will do that. The company took a gamble to bring these people to New Zealand, or try to bring them to New Zealand, without the requisite visas being applied, and they will be responsible for the costs of removing them.
Did they take a gamble? Because the company seems to think that when they got the visa for the ship to come to New Zealand, that there was an indication given that the crew would be allowed in too. Have they got that wrong?
Yes, they have. When they were approved for the 29 crew, that still had 61 crew outstanding. So they were told back on the 12th of January, when they put in their initial application for a visa, that there could be issues with all of the crew on board. The boat or the ship was given approval to come here to be delivered and for some maintenance work. And the other 61 crew of the likes of wait staff, bar staff, hairdressers and masseuses, in the eyes of Immigration New Zealand, weren't needed for that purpose. So they were told that those 61 crew did not have visas. Now, again, they decided to embark on this journey before they had visas, which they were explicitly told to do by the Ministry of Health mid-December, and they didn't do that, but they still kept on steaming towards New Zealand.
Wild Earth Travel are the ones who are chartering this ship once it gets here to travel to the sub-Antarctic. Now, Russ, who's the boss of that company, he believes it's the government that's let them down, and I just want you to listen to what he has to say.
The ship's crew that they've issued visas for, the officers and engineers are aboard the exact same ship as the hotel crew. They've all been through 27 days of quarantine. If the ship didn't have the hotel crew aboard, it would be permitted to enter New Zealand tomorrow. But because it has the hotel crew aboard, it's now no longer safe. It just doesn't make sense from a health perspective. This is an ideological approach to the border.
Is it ideological, Minister?
No, it's not, because Mr. Russ is wrong. This is not about managed isolation or quarantine. It's about the visa process. And the processes for critical workers have been in place for months now. And many businesses and sectors that would like to bring in workers because they need critical work done have applied and have been approved, and some have been declined. They went through this process and were told, in order for this ship to come to New Zealand and for the crew to come to New Zealand, those visas would have to be obtained, and they haven't, but they kept kept on steaming to New Zealand. This has got nothing to do with about time spent at sea. It's about them ticking the boxes for the criteria and going through the processes of getting visas to cross the border, which is closed at the moment to ensure that New Zealanders are safe from the threat of COVID-19.
But as he points out, these people have all been on the ship for 27 days, so they're basically
and
done.
Lisa, this is not about okay, 14 days of isolation.
So it's not
It is about the processes that they need to go through to ensure that we are letting only critical staff come, or critical workers come through the border in order to fill critical skill shortages in New Zealand.
Okay, Minister, I just wanted
the criteria have been there for some time. They tried to go through that process, and those visas weren't granted, so they can't come into New Zealand.
Right, but Minister, you said it's about keeping our border safe, and then you said no, it's not about managed isolation. So just to be clear, this is about the fact that they are simply not critical workers in your view.
Those criteria, the border is closed, but some sectors and some companies do have the ability through the exemption and exception process to bring in critical workers. There are criteria for that. You have to make sure that they have the requisite essential skills and experience, and in the view of Immigration New Zealand, the 61 staff didn't have that and actually weren't needed for the purpose which the boat or the ship was given approval. Those visas weren't granted, the border is closed, and I think the New Zealand public expect and the government demands that people adhere to the processes to keep our borders secure.
So do you think that those positions of the people that haven't got visas, they can be filled by Kiwis?
So no, the criteria is that those staff are required for the journey and have the essential skills and experience to fill those roles.
They argue that they do. They argue that they do.
Well,
and just let me explain why.
The assessment of Immigration New Zealand is that they don't.
Okay, well, they argue against that, and let's just discuss that. They say that while you might call them hairdressers and waiters and masseuses, they are trained in skills, for example, operating the lifeboats, are on the stretcher team, are on the medical team, etc. They have dual roles, and that is why the company says they are essential.
And there are a lot of other sectors, like REC workers, like primary sector, that go through the process because they have skill shortages. And if we believe that they're critical to some of those sectors and some of those shortages, they go through the process. And if they apply for visas and are approved, they will bring those staff in. You don't get to bring them in if you don't have a visa approved. These crew don't have a visa approved. In fact, they were declined twice, and the public expect us to keep the borders strictly protected.
Did any government ministry or officials advise them to offload those crews somewhere in the Pacific?
Look, I don't know that for sure, but I think perhaps because they were told back on the 12th of January and the visas were declined initially on the 22nd of January, the pragmatic option of them with the 90 crew on board to allow the 29 visa holders crew who do have a visa may have been given to the company. Either way, they continued towards New Zealand with a full complement of 90 crew, 61 of whom do not have valid visas to enter the country.
Have they got enough supplies, food, everything they need to safely be out there while this is sorted out?
Those conversations are happening now with senior border officials. If they don't have enough fuel, then of course we'll make sure that they are safe and that they can come to port. As I mentioned, we'll be able to refuel and restock. The option around whether the 29 crew will stay or whether they all go is still a live conversation between the ship's agents and border officials as we speak.
What if they come into our economic waters? What does that change? How does that change the situation legally?
As I say, it doesn't. They'll be escorted. If they need to come in, they'll be escorted into port if they need to refuel and restock. But I think earlier this week they were told that they had 61 people on board who don't hold valid visas, and they were not to enter New Zealand because those people did not have those visas.
So are the Wiggles essential critical workers of great economic benefit, and more so than the people on this ship?
So if you look at the criteria and the parameters for essential and critical workers, they were for economic, cultural and social purposes. So I didn't see the application for the Wiggles. The issue with them wasn't about their visas last week. It was about the managed isolation places they weren't able to secure. But the overall and high level messages is if businesses or individuals or organisations want to bring people into the country, then they have to get their I's dotted and their T's crossed in order to to bring people in. The border is closed for good reason, to keep us safe. We've all just enjoyed a Christmas to be able and enjoyed the safety of the level settings that we were at.
But you've said it's not a safety issue with these crew members.
But, Lisa, as I say, it's not about time and managed isolation. The criteria set says make sure that when the border is shut, to keep us safe, that if critical staff are to be brought in, there is a criteria in which to judge that. Immigration New Zealand judged that 61 of the 90 crew on board don't meet that requirement, and so they shouldn't come into New Zealand. That the owner of that ship or the agents of that ship have known that now since the 22nd of January. They continued to steam towards our border, and as we've said, officials have told them with those 61 on board, they shouldn't come to New Zealand because they don't have a visa.
The New Zealand Cruise Association has put out a press statement saying the decision by Immigration New Zealand tarnishes New Zealand as a cruise-friendly destination, and it's undone years of hard work, and it is quite simply not good enough. Your response, Minister?
Well, the only truth in that could be is if people look at that and the work that the cruise industry has done and realise that they didn't do the right work in terms of the processes and meeting the criteria to make sure that a ship could do what it wanted to do. There's a process, there are criteria. It wasn't met in time and so therefore a ship is off our coast, and those 61 people aren't meant to be coming here, and we'll try our darndest to make sure they don't.
And your timeline to get it sorted?
Oh, as soon as possible. As I say, officials are speaking to the crew of the ship and their agents to figure out what the situation is with their fuel and their stocks, whether they're able to travel to another port to gather their thoughts and give themselves more options. As I say, 29 of the crew do have valid visas. They might have to go away and offload those 61 crew, as we mentioned before, and come back for the actual purpose. But that is a call for the cruise ship company and those who contracted it to come here in New Zealand.
Thanks for your time this evening. That is Immigration Minister Kris Faafoi.